Hello, this is William Olmedo. Just as promised, I'm going to show you the multiplication of decimals, the division of decimals. And there was one more sample problem that I wanted to model, which is just setting up your multiplication, whether it's a whole number times a whole number or a whole number times a decimal. So let's get started. This was from the sample problem that I left behind that I told you to skip or use a calculator. So we're solving this equation. The left side expression reads 3 and 28 hundredths times some quantity, and that has to equal the right side of the equation, 19 and 68 hundredths. Some of you also got used to reading it as 3.28x equals 19.68. Notice when I read this, 3.28x, we know that we're multiplying when I have the coefficient, a number, in front of that variable. So this is multiplication. Remember that we talked about, we could also put the parentheses around it. We could put the multiplication dot that I mentioned. And again, there is a bit of a problem with this because this might look like a decimal. And I know that if I use the multiplication symbol x, it might also be confusing because you might wonder which one's a variable, which one's the multiplication. So you're going to see it without the parentheses, or you're going to see it 3.28x. Either or, the last or the first is multiplication. This is going to be very rare that you're going to see it. So what do we do next? We're going to apply the division property of equality. All that simply means is that this property gives us permission to divide both sides by the same amount. In this particular case, it's going to be 3 and 28 hundredths because we want that to be an equality. That equality is just saying 1. We want the equation over here on the left-hand side to equal 1. And we do that by applying the division property of equality. Applying the inverse operation. We know we're multiplying. The inverse operation of that is dividing. And the property of equality, when we apply division, tells us that what we do on one side of the equation, the left side, we must do to the right side of the equation. So this equation must always be true. Remember we talked about what makes this true. The left side, I'm going to label this as left hand side, and the right hand side must be balanced. They must always equal. We're looking for that number that when we multiply it by 3 and 28 thousandths will equal 19 and 68 thousandths. Again, we're looking for this variable. So now we're going to just a couple side notes, identify a couple vocabulary words. This is your numerator. We talked about it last time. The bottom one is your denominator. Denominator. I just remember D for down, and now the opposite is up. The top number, the bottom number, down, up. Numerator, denominator. They also use another name, especially that we're going to be setting up our division house. The number on the outside is called your divisor. The number on the inside is called your dividend. And your answer is your quotient. These are the parts of the division And somewhere over here, you're gonna exist, or you will you'll remember your remainder. I misspelled it. Remainder. So where's the dividend? Where's the divisor? Just read it quickly just to remind you where the numbers belong. So I'm going to take 3 and 28 thousandths as my divisor, and my dividend is 19.68 thousand. Remember I talked to you about division has groupings. Yes, you remember. So I'm looking for the answer. That amount into this number of groups will give me this. So what is this amount? That I put it into these number of groups will give me this answer. And you're wondering, well, how do we make groups of 3 and 28 thousands? That's impossible. You're correct, but it still goes along the same principle of division if these were whole numbers. And with that, there's a reason that we move the decimal place to the right twice. So we could make it a whole number. So we just made the divisor, which was a decimal, into a whole number. And the reason we do that is because we multiply it every single time we move it by 10. So that's technically multiplying it by 100. And if whatever we do to the outside of the division house, we must also do it to the inside. So we're going to do the same thing here. So this becomes 1,968. Just really quickly as a reminder, when I'm referring to the placeholders. So we know we have the ones followed by the decimal dot. Then comes the tenths. And after the tenths comes the hundredths. And this is DTH. So tenths is simply 1 over 10. Hundredths is 1 over 100. And we move the decimal over twice, making this a whole number. What we do to one side, we must do to the other. The equality. This has to remain true. All right. Now, how do we do this division? So I have a couple little suggestions. This works for me when I'm dividing triple numbers into 4-digit numbers. I start by rounding up my divisor. This, I'm going to approximate it to 330. And if I double 330, so if I multiply that by 2, or simply add 330 plus 330, that will give me 660. So 330 times 2 is about 660. That's too low. The next thing that I do is I'm going to use my approximation and multiply it by 10. We should remember what happens when we're multiplying any number that ends in a 10. We simply ignore it and just add it at the end. Look at that. So this would have been 33 times 1. And then because we ignored 2 zeros, we add it at the end, and that becomes 3,300. So if I try 330 times 10, that's too much of a large number. So that means that the number, the multiple, that I multiply by the divisor to give me my dividend is somewhere in the middle. I'm going to try 5. I want to see what that number is. So I'm going to take, this time I'm not going to take my approximation. I'm going to take my actual divisor of 328 and multiply that by 5. I want you to line this up. Nice and neat. We talked about placeholders. This is the ones, the tens, the hundreds, and this one is the thousands. I'm just going to put 1,000. So what do we do? 8 times 5. We got 40. Regroup it as a 4. 5 times 2 is 10. Because that regrouping of the 4 gives you 14. And then you regroup that into the 100. 5 times 3 is 15. Because the regrouping, that gives you 16. And we have a regrouping. So this gives me 1,640. Pretty close. I'm just going to check. Will 6 work? I'm going to do the same thing. I draw these lines just to show my placeholder and my regroupings. So this is a 6. 6 times 8 is good. I forgot to put the label of the placeholder. This is my ones, my tens, my hundreds, and this is my thousands. 6 times 2 is 12 plus 4 that we regroup. That's 12, 4. That's 16. Regroup for the 1. 6 times 3 is 18. Add it to the regrouping. That's 19. And we have our regrouping. There's nothing to add. Same thing right here. There was nothing to add. So we could just bring it down. Look at that. So that means 328 goes into 1,968 6 times. Good. All right. So as we're doing this, where do we put the 6? Over the 1, over the 9, over the 6, or over the 8. Remember, these have placeholders. Good. You guessed it. Over the 8 as a placeholder. What will happen if we put it over the 1, or over the 9, or over the 6? So because we know that 6 times 328 is 1968. I'm going to move over here. What's the next step? To subtract. So I like to do the same thing in my subtraction. 8 minus 8 is 0. 6 minus 6 is 0. 9 minus 9 is 0. 1 minus 1 is 0. So this doesn't have a remainder. Remember, I told you where the remainder is. So this wouldn't have a remainder. So the answer to our question that we were learning to do is x equals 6. Now, I explained a lot. I showed you a lot. But this was for you to have the detailed information on how to do the division property of equality with 2 decimals, or one of them being a decimal. This is going to help you. So let's recap. What were our steps? So the first step came from here. Dividing both sides by 3 and 28 hundredths, because that's the division property of equality. The next step was here, putting them into the division house, knowing where the divisor, the dividend, the quotient, and the remainder are. The third step was in step number 2, and that was converting the divisor into a whole number. So that was step number 3. Step number 4 was me trying to figure out how many times does the divisor go into the dividend. So this is step number 4. Remember, I tried 1, 2, 3, 4 times until I found the answer. The fifth step was doing the division. And then the last step was finding the solution. So yes, I took a long time. I showed you all the steps because I wanted to introduce the vocabulary word dividend, numerator, another word up, or the top of the fraction, denominator, the divisor, down, the bottom part of the fraction. Remember that all of this that we've been doing is to keep the equation true, balanced. The answer of 6 keeps the left side of the equation equal, the same as the right side of the equation. We talked about the placeholders, just so we could remember. What does it look like when we have the decimal? Tenths, hundredths. And then we also did the placeholders when it's to the left, ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. So I'm hoping that this helped you understand how to apply division property of equality when you're dealing with two decimals. All right, next problem. We're going to solve 8 and 34 hundredths times some quantity equals to 41 and 7 tenths. We're going to go through what we talked about, applying the division property of equality. Remember that this gives us permission. This allows us to divide both sides by the number 8.34. And the reason that it's giving us permission is because this must equal a 1, hence equality. Remember that when we're doing these equations, this must always stay balanced. That's why we're looking for that value to make sure that the left-hand side of the equation is equal to the right-hand side of the equation. All right, we quickly remember our vocabulary words. The dividend is on the top. That's also known as the numerator. Fraction bar. This is the denominator. And we're using the divisor also as the bottom. All right. So drawing our division house, 8.34, and our dividend 41.7. So 8 and 34 hundredths divided into 41 and 7 tenths. So I'm moving the decimal twice. That means that I'm going to multiply everything by 100 to make it into a whole number. Oh, what happened here? I'm only able to move it once. What happens if I move it again a second time? What must I put here? I must annex the 0. So this becomes 4,170. Because I moved it twice, so it has to be multiplied by 100. So as I explained earlier to you, I like to round my dividend of 834. This time I'm going to round it just to 830. And I'm going to play around with doubling. And this time I'm doubling by adding the same number. 0, 6, and 8 plus 8 is 16. So that's 1,660. A little. All right, so remember this is 830 multiplied by 2. So what happens if I'm looking at 830, multiplying that by 10? If I hide the zeros, this is 83 times 1, and I bring them back, that's 8,300. Way too big. So I'm going to try a 5, somewhere in the middle between the multiple of 2 and the multiple of 10. So instead of me taking 830, I'm going to multiply it by 834. Now I'm trying to hone in on how many times it goes in. This is just for my placeholders, my ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. 4 times 5, 20. Regroup the 2. 5 times 3 is 15. And added to the regrouping of 2, 15, that would be 17. Regroup the 1, 8 times 5 is 40. Plus the regrouping of 1, that gives me 41. Well, we found it. So 834 goes into 4,170 times. Remember we talked about where we're going to place it. And we have to go through the process of subtracting to make sure that this is going to be a 0. The placeholder markings, 0, subtract 0, or take away, 7, subtract 7, 0, 0, 0, there's no remainder. So this gave us a solution of x is equal to 5. I didn't check the last problem, but if we make the substitution of 8.34 and we multiply that by 5, we put a question mark. We don't know if it's balanced. This is taking me to the next problem that I'm going to show you in multiplying one column that's a decimal, or sorry, one number that's a decimal and one that is not, or both of them being a decimal. So you're going to have to stay tuned for this problem. I will come back and show you once we multiply the rest of them, but this is how we will check. Remember that this has to be true. So I will come back and show you this once I show you the multiplication for us to check. So let's review. What did we do? The division property of equality tells us that we could divide both sides by 8 and 34 hundredths in order to make this a 1. Remember that this could switch on us, that we could have 41.7 equals 8.34x, and that will be the same thing. So the division property allows us to divide by the same quantity both sides. Right, so it is both sides. So there's two things that it's telling you. Divide by the same quantities and divide by the same quantity. So you can get that 1 in order for this to be true. So that was step number 1. Step number 2 is right here. The division house. Step number 3 was in step number 2 because we were making the divisor a whole number of 834. So this was step number 3. Step number 4 was us locating how many times the divisor goes into the dividend, and we found it to be 5 right here. And then once we found it, we applied the properties of division. We went through our multiplication, we went through our subtraction, we found no 0, and we came up with the answer. Hope this helps. Third problem that we're going to solve. So this one is applying the multiplication property of equality. And that simply means what we do to one side of the equation, we must do to the other side. So as I was showing you to solve the previous two problems with division, this one requires us to multiply both sides by 8 and 5/10. Remember I explained in the first problem why we use the parentheses to represent the multiplication, because that dot, the multiplication dot, could be confused with a decimal. Or if we use the variable x, sorry, the x multiplication symbol, that could be mistaken by a variable. So the parentheses simply tells us 16 times a quantity of 8 and 5/100. You could put parentheses around both of those quantities or just one like I did. So we could go 16 times 8.5. So how do we get an equality of this? So this looks like a 1 right here. Pardon my drawing. Trying to make this look like the best one that I could do. But that's your equality. This is what multiplication property of equality tells you. That it allows you to divide both sides. In this case, we're multiplying both sides by 8.5 because we want this quantity to be 1. So that gives us the variable r. That's the one we're solving for, because we know that it's some quantity into groups of 8 and 8 and 5/10 will give us 16 in each of those groups. So what will be that quantity? And then the right side of the equation is just 16 times 8.5. So right-hand side of the equation must be balanced to the left-hand side, and our job is to find the r. So in multiplication, this, as now you're moving up into middle school and high school, is perfectly way to show multiplication. I still like my elementary way. 16 multiplied by 8.5. I like setting it up in this fashion because I know that I'm not going to get confused by that symbol, because that's telling me to multiply. All right, I'm still going to draw my placeholders. Good practice. This is my ones, my tens, my hundreds, and my thousands, just in case I get there. So what do we do with that decimal? We ignore it. Just focus on what you have to multiply. So 6 times 5 is 30. We have a regrouping. 5 times 1 plus a regrouping of 3. And there's nothing else to multiply. Because this, I'm treating it as a double-digit number, that means that we have to multiply a second time around by the 8 that's in the tens place. 8 times 6, oops, that's 48. I have another regrouping. This gets a little bit messy. I'm just going to put my new regrouping with a circle right up there. 8 times 1 is 8 plus 4 is 12. So remember, I just added that just to help me keep track of my numbers. So now we're going to add them. The annex 0, 8 plus 8, 16. Good. Regroup of 1, 2 plus 1 is 3, and then the 1. So I did ignore my decimal. That was 1 decimal place. The 5/10, that's 1 decimal place. 1 decimal place. Guess what? Because I ignored it, I have to bring it back by placing it again as 1 decimal place. So 16 times the quantity of 8 and 5/10 is 136. So remember what I asked or what I stated? I'm looking for this quantity. This is the number of groupings that I have. And this is how many are in each group. So that quantity happens to be 136. So what about the check? you could do the check. 136 fraction bar of 8.5. Remember, 8.5 is your divisor into 136. You happen to move the decimal once, and you have to move the decimal once because we need this to be a whole number. This happens to be 85 divided into 1,360. The beauty when we work with decimals is that the check is already present. We already did that math. We know that 85 goes into 1,316 5 times. Placeholders. And once we subtract, everything comes out to be 0. So this checks with our solution. Good. Let's review real quick. We started with the multiplication property of equality. It's what allows us to do multiply both sides by 8.5, making the coefficient. This is your coefficient. There's a 1 up here at the top. A 1. That's quality. It then allows us to multiply 16 by 8 and 5/10. This was just me explaining why we use parentheses and not the multiplication x or multiplication dot. So now that we have the two quantities we're going to multiply, we set it up in old school elementary style, 16 times 8.5. Remember that we ignored that decimal place that we discovered when we go through the process of multiplying. I like to keep my placeholders. And then once I found the product, because this is the product of these two numbers, we reintroduced the decimal place and we went through the check. And that was our answer. So coming back to the previous problem, because I wanted to show you multiplication. So we're going to be checking our work on this one by multiplying. I already told you that I like an old school multiplication. And my placeholders, I'm ignoring 2 placeholders. You're going to see why. So I'm moving on over here, 8 and 34 hundredths, multiplying that by 5. The placeholders, 4 times 5 is 20, 3 group of 2, so this is my 1s, and 10s, and hundreds, and 9,000. 5 times 3 is 15, and the 2 that got carried over is 17, and I have another regrouping. 8 times 5 is 40, plus that 1 from the regrouping. Oops, 41. And remember, because I ignored 2 placeholders, I need to bring back 2 placeholders. And by me showing you this multiplication, the left-hand side is 41.7, which is equivalent to the right-hand side. So this equation checks. Just to brush up on your multiplication, we just practiced how to multiply, how to divide when the numbers are decimals. This time there are no decimals. So 35 times 6, because I'm not solving an equation, this is just a numerical expression. I could also write it with the parentheses. I could also write it with the dot, the multiplication dot. So it's not going to confuse you. Remember that I like to set it up the way you were taught in elementary school, to my placeholders. This is my 1s, my 10s, my hundreds, and my thousands place. 6 times 5. So before I continue with this, I'm going to take you back to the bar diagram that you were taught in elementary school. or the matrix or an array. So I'm going to make this 5 columns. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to make this 6 row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 rows. And if you look at it, you will know why it is 30, because you're going to count all those little blocks. So how would I represent 35? I would have to go 35 columns by 6 and then add all of them up. So by us doing the regrouping and doing this, we are speeding up our process of multiplication. So this is the 0, the regrouping. 6 times 3 is 18. Plus the regrouping of 3. Uh-huh. All right. And there's your answer. Good. What about if I give you 42 times 4? Can you set that one up? And remember that this was just a quick review of the way you were learning multiplication by the array method, especially small numbers. When it comes to large numbers, you just have to be careful with the regroupings. All right, so I hope that by me showing you these problems of how to multiply, how to divide decimals will help you understand the lessons that were introduced last week, this week, and the connections that are going to be made once we start solving word problems that involve decimals. You're going to be able to add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals as it requires to solve a one-step equation.